Hey there. As a journalist and content creator, I am steeped in culture constantly. And what I want to talk to you about today is how Marxism contributes to the conversation around culture in capitalist USA. Because as you know, nothing exists in a vacuum, neither does culture. First things first, what is culture? Culture, as we understand it, is all the things that make up the relationships of society in a certain degree, such as art, entertainment, style, how people interpret, rituals, things of that nature. So second, and in order to look at how Marxism contributes to the conversation around culture, we have to talk about what Marxism is and how it interprets society, right? And I just kind of first and foremost want to say, just in case you didn't know, Karl Marx, the human version of him, is dead. I know. He didn't make it to 2018. He didn't make it to 2000. And I only say that because, the world changes in the sense of technology and how people communicate and things of that nature. And if we're going to look at Marxism, I think it's really great to see it as a basis for the base of society, of how society functions and what it's built on at its core. But also in that sense, understanding that new things occur. We as people who are constantly learning and adapting can add to this great scientific way of looking at society that Marx gave us. So, with that said, Marxism deals with the class struggle, right? The idea that there's two main classes, capitalist bosses who own the means of production, and basically workers who, through their labor, basically creates the wealth that these bosses live off of. And if we're gonna get technical with it, and all of this, I promise you, comes back around to how Marxism contributes to the conversation around culture, is the idea that Marx divided society kind of into two pieces. One being the base, the means of production, workers, employee and employer, basically the material way in which something's built, such as like the capitalist structure, right? And then the second part of society was the superstructure, and that deals with like the relationships that are influenced by this economic base of whatnot, of such as rituals, political structures, and you guessed it, culture. The idea is that the base influences how our culture, how our rituals, how our religion is structured, to kind of, in this kind of one-way, two-way relationship between these two parts of society. And culture, in Marx's idea, is in the superstructure of that. Now, I point that out because, there's a couple ways you can interpret that if you are looking at Marxism and the way it interprets society. You can look at it in one way being that if the base that we have, let's say, it's capitalism, this idea of capitalists, exploiting workers through certain tools of society to keep them exploited and in this subjugated position, that culture then is used to reinforce this status quo, right? This idea that, this class, these bosses, these capitalists use certain forms of entertainment and culture to basically keep pushing forth the message. Culture at times can reinforce and justify inequality in that sense. And I agree with that in the sense of, culture, depending on who, certain forms in culture, depending on who's controlling it, yes, they can push a certain message. And if it's controlled by a certain class that wants to keep another class in a certain way, then they will control it to be about creating a narrative to make you want to stay in your position, right? So that's one way to interpret it. But there's another way to interpret this. The other way to interpret it is the idea of, just like, it was said before, Marx and Engels had said that capitalism also creates its own gravediggers through the workers. That's in variety of ways, right? So I think one of those ways is through culture, in the sense of when people use art to resist or to subvert certain norms and status quo that we've been, used to. And that's another way of kind of combating that system. And we see that, we see certain aspects of culture, certain aspects of religion and things of that nature that reinforce the status quo, that reinforce inequality and white supremacy and sexism, things like that. And then we see other aspects of culture, usually controlled by, activists, working people, people of color, marginalized communities, where when in the driver's seat of culture, they put out content such as movies, art, and things of that nature that challenge the status quo, that challenge the way we interpret a society, that challenge white supremacy, sexism, racism, and things of that nature, are tools that, capitalism uses to subjugate working people. And I look out for both, right? By understanding how Marx looks at society, I'm able to kind of pinpoint when a certain aspect of a message of a book or a movie or any kind of form of culture is very much trying to reinforce status quo to me. I can point that out and be like, okay, this main messaging is trying to get me to accept something that's repressive or something that basically is not in my interest, right? And then I can also point out, and also in that sense, lift up art and culture that chooses to, whether overtly or in a subtle way, to combat those aspects that are part of the status quo of this system. And that's what I do when looking at content, when looking at culture. And I'm able to do that because of the fact that of Marxism, basically. It helps me know crappy capitalist art and really awesome activist or just basically authentic culture that comes from people whose voices need to be uplifted. And in that sense, it's awesome. So that's what I think Marxism does in terms of being able to contribute to the conversation around culture.